The old cemetery of Millhaven rested on a gentle slope overlooking the sea. It had been there longer than anyone in town could remember, its iron gates creaking with age and its stone walls covered in moss. On most nights, the only sounds came from the distant waves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Walter had worked as the groundskeeper for almost 20 years. He knew every headstone, every tree, and every patch of uneven ground that might trip someone during a funeral. The cemetery was his second home, though he'd never admit that to anyone in town. They already thought he was strange for spending so much time among the dead. Better company than most of the living, Walter often mumbled to himself as he swept fallen leaves from the pathways or trimmed the grass around the older graves. Tonight was no different from hundreds of others. Walter locked his small shed of tools and began his final walk around the grounds before heading home. The October air had a bite to it, and he pulled his worn jacket tighter around his broad shoulders. His flashlight beam bobbed along the path as he walked, casting long shadows from the headstones. He was nearly at the gate when he noticed something odd from the corner of his eye. A faint glow, bluish-green like the algae that sometimes washed up on the beach after a storm. Walter turned, thinking it might be teenagers with glow sticks or someone leaving lights on a grave, though that wasn't allowed after hours. The glow came from the oldest section of the cemetery, where the town's founders and early settlers rested. Walter sighed and turned back, his boots crunching on the gravel path. If it was kids messing around, he'd have to chase them out. But as he approached the source of the light, he saw no one. The glow seemed to come from beneath the soil itself, seeping up around the edges of a weathered gravestone. Walter crouched down, his knees protesting after a long day of work. His calloused fingers brushed aside the overgrown grass to read the name carved into the stone. Eliza Blackwood, 1878-1923. He read aloud. The words, beloved daughter, sister, seeker of truth were carved below the dates, though time had worn them down until they were barely visible. The strange glow pulsed gently from the soil covering the grave, casting an eerie light on the underside of Walter's weathered face. In all his years tending this cemetery, he'd never seen anything like it. Must be some kind of chemical reaction, he muttered, trying to convince himself. Probably something leaking from the coffin. Yet even as he said it, he knew that made no sense. Any chemicals from an embalming process would have broken down decades ago. And this wasn't just a faint phosphorescence like he sometimes saw on rotting wood. This was a steady, almost deliberate glow. Walter stood up and took a step back. Maybe he should report this to someone, but who? The town council would think he was making things up or going senile. The local paper would turn it into a ghost story to sell more copies. Neither option appealed to him. He decided to come back the next night and see if the glow was still there. Maybe it was just some weird one-time thing like swamp gas or whatever caused those lights people sometimes saw over marshes. But the next night the glow was stronger, and the night after that, stronger still. By the fourth night, Walter could see the blue-green light from the cemetery gates, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the ground. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Sitting at his kitchen table that evening, he flipped through his small address book until he found the number for the local university. He'd met a professor there last year when she brought students to study the lichen growing on some of the older tombstones. She'd seemed smart but not full of herself like some educated folks. Maybe she'd know what this was without making a big fuss about it. The phone rang 3 times before a woman answered. Department of Earth Sciences, Dr. Chen speaking. Walter cleared his throat. Hello there. This is Walter Jenkins from the Millhaven Cemetery. We met last spring when you brought some students to look at the, plant stuff growing on the stones. Mr. Jenkins, yes, I remember. Those lichen samples were quite helpful for our environmental impact study. What can I do for you? Walter hesitated. It sounded silly now that he was about to say it out loud. Well, there's something strange happening at one of the graves. It's glowing. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Walter braced himself for laughter or a polite brush-off. Instead, Dr. Chen asked, what color is the glow? Sort of blue-green, like those glow sticks kids wave around at fairs, but softer. And it's coming from underground, not just sitting on top. Interesting. How long has this been happening? First noticed it 4 nights ago. Gets a bit brighter each night. Another pause. Mr. Jenkins, would you mind if I came by tomorrow to take a look? I could bring some equipment to take readings. It might be nothing serious, but it's worth checking. Walter felt relief wash over him. That'd be fine. I'm there all day, but the glow only shows up after dark. I'll come by around 7 then. And Mr. Jenkins? It's probably best not to mention this to others just yet. No need to start rumors until we know what we're dealing with. Walter agreed readily. The last thing he wanted was a crowd of thrill-seekers trampling through his cemetery. The next evening, Walter paced by the front gates, checking his watch every few minutes. At exactly 7, a small car pulled up, and Dr. Chen stepped out. She was a petite woman with straight black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a sweater under her open coat. Not the stuffy professor outfit Walter had half expected. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, shaking his hand. "I've brought some basic equipment to start with." She gestured to a backpack and what looked like a metal detector. "It's over this way," Walter said, leading her through the winding paths. "Gets brighter as it gets darker, so we might need to wait a bit to see it properly." Even in the fading twilight, though, the glow was visible as they approached the old grave. Dr. Chen stopped several feet away, her eyes widening slightly. "You weren't exaggerating," she said quietly. She set down her backpack and pulled out several instruments Walter didn't recognize. One looked like a fancy thermometer, another like a small tablet computer with a wand attached to it. She worked methodically, taking readings around the perimeter of the grave without disturbing the soil. "The temperature is slightly elevated, compared to the surrounding area," she murmured, more to herself than to Walter. "About 3 degrees warmer." She waved the wand-like device over the center of the grave where the glow was brightest. The tablet screen flickered with numbers and graphs Walter couldn't make sense of. "That's strange," Dr. Chen said, frowning at her device. "I'm getting radiation readings, but not any known pattern. Not dangerous levels, but unusual." "Radiation?" Walter stepped back instinctively. "Like from a nuclear plant or something?" Dr. Chen shook her head. "No, nothing like that. More like, well, I'm not sure what it's like. I've never seen the signature before." She looked up at Walter, her face serious in the eerie glow. "Mr. Jenkins, do you know anything about the person buried here?" Walter shrugged. "Not much. Eliza Blackwood. Died in 1923. The Blackwoods were one of the founding families of Millhaven, but most of them moved away decades ago. I think there's still a cousin or something living in the old family house on Harbor Street." Dr. Chen nodded slowly, then set down her instruments and pulled a small trowel from her backpack. "I'd like to take a soil sample, if that's all right. Just from the surface, nothing that would disturb the grave itself." Walter hesitated but nodded. He watched as she carefully scraped a small amount of soil into a specimen jar, the dirt glowing faintly even as she sealed it away. "I'll need to run some tests on this," she said, packing up her equipment. "And I'd like to bring a colleague tomorrow night, if that's okay. He specializes in unusual geological phenomena." "So you think it's something natural?" Walter asked hopefully. Dr. Chen closed her backpack before answering. In the growing darkness, the grave's glow cast her face in sharp relief, making her look both younger and somehow ancient at the same time. "Mr. Jenkins," she said carefully, "in my 15 years of scientific research, I've learned that natural covers a much wider range of phenomena than most people realize. But no, I've never seen anything in nature that behaves quite like this." She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Whatever's happening here, it's not random. Those patterns in the radiation readings, they're too organized, too deliberate." "What are you saying?" Walter asked, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the October air. Dr. Chen looked back at the glowing grave, her expression unreadable. "I'm saying that after 100 years in the ground, Eliza Blackwood is trying to tell us something, and I think we should listen." The next evening, Walter arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual. He couldn't focus on his regular duties all day, his mind constantly drifting back to the glowing grave and Dr. Chen's troubling words. He'd spent most of the night tossing and turning, imagining what message a century-old corpse could possibly want to send. When Dr. Chen's car pulled up at the gates, Walter noticed she wasn't alone. A tall, thin man with wild gray hair and thick glasses stepped out of the passenger side, carrying several large cases of equipment. "Mr. Jenkins," Dr. Chen called, waving as they approached. "This is Professor Rivera from the physics department. He specializes in radiation and quantum phenomena." The professor juggled his equipment awkwardly as he attempted to shake Walter's hand. "Fascinating case, absolutely fascinating," he said, his words tumbling out quickly. "Amara showed me the preliminary readings, and I must say I've never seen anything quite like it in 30 years of research." Walter nodded uncomfortably. He hadn't expected this to become such a big deal. "The grave's this way," he said, leading them along the familiar path. Even though the sun had barely set, the blue-green glow was already visible from 20 feet away, stronger than the night before. Walter heard Professor Rivera suck in a sharp breath. "Good heavens," the professor whispered. "It's beautiful." They spent the next hour setting up equipment around the grave, tripods with strange sensors, a laptop computer, and something that looked like a miniature satellite dish pointed directly at the center of the glowing soil. Walter watched from a respectful distance, answering occasional questions about the cemetery's history or the weather patterns of the past few days. "The energy signature is getting stronger," Dr. Chen said, staring at her tablet, "up nearly 20% from yesterday's readings." Professor Rivera nodded excitedly. "And look at these wavelength patterns. They're not random. There's a clear sequence repeating every 7 minutes and 13 seconds. Could it be some kind of natural gas seeping up from underground?" Walter asked hopefully. "I've heard swamp gas can glow sometimes." The two scientists exchanged glances. "This isn't methane or any known bioluminescence," Dr. Chen said gently. "The radiation pattern is, well, it's structured almost like a code." "A code?" Walter repeated. "Like someone sending a message?" "Or something," Professor Rivera muttered, adjusting his glasses as he bent closer to the glowing soil. "I'd like to take a core sample, see what's happening a few inches down." Dr. Chen looked at Walter. "Would that be all right? We'd be very careful. Not to disturb the actual grave." Walter hesitated. Disturbing graves was strictly against cemetery policy, but then again, so were graves that lit up like Christmas trees. "I guess so," he finally said, "but just a small hole, and we fill it back in properly afterward." Professor Rivera nodded eagerly and pulled a narrow metal tube from one of his cases. Carefully, he pressed it into the soil at the edge of the glowing area, about 2 feet from the headstone. The tube slid in with surprising ease, and when he pulled it out, the soil inside glowed even brighter than the surface. "Extraordinary," he breathed, capping both ends of the tube. "The phenomenon increases with depth." Dr. Chen leaned closer to examine the hole left by the sampling tube. "Wait, what's that?" Something gleamed in the small hole. Not the blue-green glow, but a different kind of shine, like metal catching light. She carefully widened the hole with a small trowel, revealing what looked like a thin crystal filament running horizontally through the soil. "It looks almost like a wire," she said, her voice hushed. Professor Rivera crouched beside her, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "Not a wire, a crystal formation. But I've never seen crystals grow in such a perfect straight line." Walter felt a chill run through him despite the mild evening. "Are you saying someone buried something electrical with the coffin?" "No," Dr. Chen said slowly. "I'm saying these crystal formations appear to have grown naturally, but in very unnatural patterns." She carefully brushed more soil away, revealing more crystal filaments branching off from the first, forming what looked disturbingly like a circuit board made of glowing minerals. "This is impossible," Professor Rivera whispered. "Crystals don't organize themselves like this in nature." Walter stepped back, suddenly wanting distance between himself and whatever was happening in that grave. Maybe we should stop, cover it back up, and leave it alone. But the scientists were too fascinated to heed his concerns. They took more samples, more readings, Speaking in technical terms Walter couldn't follow. Words like quantum coherence and non-random crystalline matrices floated through their conversation. As darkness fell completely, the glow intensified until it lit up their faces from below, like people telling ghost stories with flashlights. Walter checked his watch. Nearly 10 o'clock. He was about to suggest they call it a night when headlights swept across the cemetery gates. "Are you expecting anyone else?" he asked Dr. Chen. She looked up, frowning. "No." 2 black SUVs pulled up outside the gates. Men in dark suits stepped out, moving with the coordinated precision that screamed government to Walter. His stomach sank. "How did they find out?" he muttered. Dr. Chen quickly closed her laptop. "I only told Professor Rivera and he wouldn't—" "The radiation," Professor Rivera interrupted, his face pale. "Any unusual radiation signature would trigger automated alerts in certain government systems, especially patterns like these." A tall woman with short gray hair approached the gates, flanked by 2 younger men in similar dark suits. She held up an ID card that Walter couldn't read from this distance. "Evening," she called through the gates. "I'm Director Fletcher with the Department of Energy. We've detected unusual radiation signatures from this location. I need to speak with whoever's in charge." Walter reluctantly walked over and unlocked the gates. "I'm the groundskeeper," he said, "Walter Jenkins." Director Fletcher's sharp eyes looked past him to the glowing grave where the 2 scientists were hastily packing their equipment. "And those individuals?" "Researchers from the local university," Walter explained. "Dr. Chen called me about a strange glow coming from one of our older graves. We were just trying to figure out what it is." The woman nodded as if this explained everything. "I'll need to speak with them as well. And I'm afraid this area is now under federal jurisdiction pending our investigation." Walter felt a flash of anger. "This is town property. You can't just—" "Actually, we can," she interrupted smoothly, handing him an official-looking document. "This is a temporary seizure order signed by a federal judge, citing potential radiological hazards. My team will be setting up a perimeter and conducting our own tests." As if on cue, more vehicles pulled up. Men in what looked like hazmat suits began unloading equipment far more sophisticated than what the professors had brought. Dr. Chen approached, her face tight with frustration. "Director, I'm Dr. Amara Chen from the university. The radiation levels are well within safe limits. There's no need for all this." "That's for us to determine, Dr. Chen." The director's voice was polite but firm. "I'd like copies of all your readings and samples, please." Professor Rivera clutched his sample case protectively. "These are university property. We've followed all proper protocols. And now you'll follow one more," Director Fletcher said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "National Security Protocol." Walter watched helplessly as more government personnel swarmed into his cemetery, setting up lights and equipment around Eliza Blackwood's grave. Within 20 minutes, they had erected a white tent over the entire area and strung yellow caution tape in a wide perimeter. One of the men in suits approached Walter. "Sir, we'll need you to sign this non-disclosure agreement. Everything you've seen here tonight is classified." "Classified?" Walter repeated incredulously. "It's a glowing grave in a public cemetery." "Not anymore," the man said flatly, holding out a pen. Later, after signing papers he barely understood, and watching Dr. Chen and Professor Rivera argue fruitlessly with Director Fletcher, Walter found himself being escorted to the gates of his own cemetery. "When can I come back to work?" he asked the stern-faced agent beside him. "We'll contact you," was all the man would say. Walter looked back at the white tent glowing faintly from within, government vehicles surrounding it like vultures around a kill. Whatever Eliza Blackwood was trying to tell them, it seemed the government wanted to hear it first. As he walked to his truck, Walter noticed something that made him stop cold. Every few seconds, power seemed to flicker in the tent, not from equipment malfunctioning but in a regular pattern. The same pattern he'd seen in the glowing soil earlier, like a heartbeat or a countdown. And somehow Walter knew instinctively that whatever was happening in Eliza Blackwood's grave, it wasn't going to stop just because the government had shown up. In fact, He had the terrible feeling that things were just getting started. Walter couldn't sleep. 3 days had passed since the government had taken over his cemetery, and he hadn't been allowed back to work. They'd set up roadblocks on the street leading to the gates with signs claiming water main repairs that fooled exactly no one in a town as small as Millhaven. He paced his small living room, pausing occasionally to peer through the blinds at the distant glow that now rose above the cemetery like a miniature aurora. Whatever was happening at Eliza Blackwood's grave wasn't slowing down. If anything, it seemed to be speeding up. His phone rang, startling him. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Mr. Jenkins? This is Dr. Chen." Her voice was hushed, as if she was afraid of being overheard. "Can you meet me at Harborside Cafe in 20 minutes? There's something you need to see." Walter glanced at the clock. Almost 10 p.m. "The cafe closes at 9. Tom's keeping it open for us. Please, it's important." Walter agreed and grabbed his jacket. The October night had turned chilly, and a light fog rolled in from the sea as he drove the short distance to the harbor. The cafe's lights were dimmed, but through the window, he could see Dr. Chen sitting at a corner table with an older woman he didn't recognize. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. Tom, the owner, nodded to him from behind the counter. "Coffee's fresh," he said. "I'll be in the back if you need anything." He disappeared through the kitchen door, leaving them alone. Dr. Chen waved Walter over. "Thank you for coming," she said. "This is Mrs. Thornhill. She's the town librarian and local historian." The older woman nodded. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice surprisingly deep and rich. "I understand you're the one who discovered the unusual situation at Eliza Blackwood's grave." Walter sat down heavily. "That's one way of putting it. Mrs. Thornhill has been helping me research Eliza Blackwood," Dr. Chen explained. "The university has been shut out of the investigation. The government confiscated all our samples and readings. They're claiming it's a radiation leak from an old medical waste site." "That's ridiculous," Walter scoffed. "There's never been any medical waste in my cemetery." "Exactly," Dr. Chen said. "They're hiding something. So I decided to find out who Eliza Blackwood really was." Mrs. Thornhill opened an old leather portfolio on the table. "I've been the town librarian for 32 years, she said. "And before that, my mother held the position for 40 years. The Blackwoods were one of Millhaven's founding families, and they donated generously to the library, including some items that were never officially cataloged." She carefully removed a small, leather-bound book from the portfolio. This was Eliza Blackwood's personal journal. It was supposed to be sealed until 2023, exactly 100 years after her death. Walter leaned forward. "That's this year." Mrs. Thornhill nodded. "The timing of your discovery is significant." She opened the journal carefully. The pages were yellowed with age, covered in neat, precise handwriting. Eliza Blackwood wasn't just any small-town woman of her time. She was a scientist, self-taught, of course, as women weren't exactly welcomed in universities back then, but brilliant nonetheless. Dr. Chen picked up the story. "According to what we've pieced together, she studied at home, corresponding with scientists across the country and in Europe. She was particularly interested in alternative energy sources." "Alternative energy," Walter repeated. "In the 1920s? Mrs. Thornhill smiled slightly. "People have been searching for better ways to harness energy for centuries, Mr. Jenkins. Eliza was simply ahead of her time." She turned a page in the journal. "She became fascinated with what she called earth energies, natural electrical currents and magnetic fields, and she made a discovery." Walter looked between the two women. "What kind of discovery?" "That's where things get complicated," Dr. Chen said. Her later journal entries become increasingly cryptic. She started using a code of her own creation. Mrs. Thornhill has been trying to decipher it. The librarian adjusted her glasses. "What we do know is that in early 1923, Eliza wrote to several prominent scientists about a breakthrough that she claimed would revolutionize humanity's relationship with energy. None took her seriously. A woman from a small coastal town making such claims was easy to dismiss. And then she died, Walter said. That same year. Yes, Mrs. Thornhill confirmed, officially from influenza, but her final journal entries suggest she was afraid. She believed someone had discovered her work and wanted to steal or suppress. Dr. Chen tapped the journal page. This entry just a week before her death says, "They will not have what isn't ready to be given. I have ensured the gift will only be received when the time is right." Walter felt a chill run down his spine. "And you think that time is now? 100 years later?" "Look at this," Mrs. Thornhill said, pulling out a folded paper from the back of the journal. She carefully unfolded it to reveal a hand-drawn diagram. Walter leaned closer. The drawing showed a complex arrangement of lines and circles that meant nothing to him, but in the center was something he recognized, a pattern of crystalline filaments, remarkably similar to what they'd uncovered at the grave. "This looks like what we found, in the soil," he said. Dr. Chen nodded excitedly. "Exactly. And look at the date on this drawing." Walter squinted at the faded numbers. October 15th, 1923. "That's next week," he said, the realization dawning. 100 years to the day. The date of her death, Mrs. Thornhill confirmed, or as she refers to it in her final entry, the beginning. Walter sat back, trying to process what they were telling him. So Eliza Blackwood discovered some kind of energy source, and instead of sharing it, she... what? Buried it with herself? Programmed it to activate a century later? The technology to do such a thing shouldn't have existed in the 1920s, Dr. Chen acknowledged. But those crystal formations we found aren't natural. They've been growing, organizing themselves according to some predetermined pattern. Mrs. Thornhill turned to the final pages of the journal. Her last entries mentioned something she called a living circuit, a system that would use her own remains as an organic component, growing and evolving over decades. That's... Walter struggled for words. That's impossible, and frankly, disturbing. Yet it's happening, Dr. Chen said quietly. Those crystal formations are following the exact blueprint in her diagram, and they're accelerating. According to my calculations, they'll complete their growth cycle on October 15th. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and all three of them jumped. A couple of teenagers wandered in, laughing and talking loudly. Tom emerged from the back to serve them, giving Walter an apologetic look. "We should go somewhere more private," Mrs. Thornhill suggested, carefully returning the journal to her portfolio. They walked out into the foggy night, heading toward the small park that overlooked the harbor. The mist swirled around the streetlights, creating halos of golden light. "There's something else," Dr. Chen said as they walked. "I've been monitoring the town's electrical grid through a colleague at the power company. There have been unusual power fluctuations over the past few days." "Blackouts?" Walter asked. "No, the opposite. Brief surges of extra power entering the grid, power with no identifiable source." Walter stopped walking. "You're saying the grave is generating electricity?" "Not exactly. It's more like it's recycling it somehow, drawing power in, transforming it, and sending it back out." Mrs. Thornhill adjusted her glasses. "According to what I've been able to decipher from Eliza's notes, she believed in a universal energy field that could be tapped without depleting natural resources. She called it the eternal current." "So what happens on October 15th, Walter asked, "when this 100-year countdown or whatever it is finishes?" The two women exchanged glances. "We don't know," Dr. Chen admitted. "But I think the government has figured out at least part of it. They're bringing in more equipment every day. Military vehicles were seen arriving last night." Walter looked toward the distant glow of the cemetery, now partially obscured by fog. "We need to get back in there, see what they're doing." "That won't be easy," Dr. Chen said. "The security is tight." Mrs. Thornhill smiled slightly. "Perhaps not as tight as they think. The Blackwood family didn't just help found this town, they built it, including a network of tunnels during Prohibition, one of which leads directly to the family mausoleum in the cemetery. Walter stared at her. There's a secret tunnel into my cemetery and I never knew about it. The entrance is hidden in the basement of the old Blackwood house on Harbor Street, Mrs. Thornhill explained. The house has been abandoned for years since the last Blackwood moved away. Except the last Blackwood didn't move away, Dr. Chen said, giving the librarian a meaningful look. Mrs. Thornhill sighed and removed her glasses. My mother was a Blackwood. Eliza was my great-aunt. I've kept it quiet all these years because, well, there were rumors about the family. About Eliza specifically. I didn't want those shadows following me. Walter looked at her with new eyes. So you're saying you can get us into the cemetery without the government knowing? I'm saying, Mrs. Thornhill replied, her voice taking on a new strength, that whatever Eliza left behind belongs to this town, not to some government agency that swooped in to claim it. The tunnel hasn't been used in decades, but if it's still passable, yes, I can get us in. Dr. Chen looked at her watch. The timing will be tight. Today's the 12th. That gives us just 3 days to figure out what Eliza was planning and what's going to happen when her countdown ends. And what if it's dangerous? Walter asked. What if there's a reason the government is so interested? Mrs. Thornhill's face was solemn in the misty light. My great-aunt was many things, Mr. Jenkins, but she wasn't destructive. Whatever she left behind, she meant it as a gift, and I intend to make sure it's delivered as she intended. The old Blackwood house stood at the end of Harbor Street, its weathered Victorian facade looming against the darkening sky. Years of neglect had left the once grand home with peeling paint and sagging shutters. A rusted iron fence surrounded the property, the gate hanging loose on one hinge. Walter parked his truck a block away as Mrs. Thornhill had instructed. No sense drawing attention to their presence. He walked briskly through the evening shadows, collar turned up against the chill. The appointed meeting time was 8 p.m., just after sunset, when they'd have the cover of darkness but enough time to reach the cemetery before midnight. He found Dr. Chen already waiting at the side gate, a backpack slung over her shoulder. Any sign of Mrs. Thornhill? He asked quietly. Dr. Chen shook her head. Not yet, but look at this. She pointed toward the distant hill where the cemetery lay. The blue-green glow had intensified dramatically, visible even from here as a pulsing dome of light that rose above the tree line. Good Lord, Walter muttered. The whole town must be able to see that. They can, Dr. Chen confirmed. It's all over social media. The government's story about a chemical spill isn't holding up anymore. They've expanded the roadblocks to keep people away, claiming it's toxic. The sound of footsteps made them both turn. Mrs. Thornhill approached, carrying an old leather satchel. She wore practical clothes, dark pants, boots, and a navy sweater, a far cry from her usual librarian attire. Sorry I'm late, she said. I had to make sure I wasn't followed. The government agents have been watching my house. They suspect you know something? Walter asked. Mrs. Thornhill's mouth tightened. They came to the library yesterday, asked for all records related to the Blackwood family. Official town histories only, of course. They don't know about Eliza's private journal. She withdrew a large iron key from her satchel. This hasn't been used in decades, she said, approaching the side door of the house. My mother showed me the tunnel once when I was a girl. She made me promise never to tell anyone. The key turned stiffly in the lock and the door creaked open to reveal a musty hallway. They stepped inside, Dr. Chen switching on a flashlight to guide their way. The house was like a time capsule. Furniture draped in yellowed sheets, picture frames still hanging on walls, thick dust covering everything. The basement entrance is in the kitchen, Mrs. Thornhill said, leading them through the silent rooms. In the kitchen? She moved aside an old rug to reveal a trapdoor built into the wooden floor. It took both Walter and Dr. Chen to lift the heavy door, unleashing a cloud of dust and the smell of damp earth. Careful on the stairs, Mrs. Thornhill warned, shining her own flashlight down into the darkness. They might not be stable after all these years. They descended one by one into a stone-walled basement. Wooden shelves lined the walls, still holding ancient preserving jars and dusty wine bottles. Mrs. Thornhill walked directly to the far wall and ran her hands along the stones. It should be right. Here. She pressed a particular stone, and with a grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward. Beyond lay a narrow tunnel, its walls supported by timber beams. Prohibition era, she explained. The Blackwoods ran a smuggling operation, bringing liquor up from ships in the harbor and distributing it inland. This tunnel leads all the way to the family mausoleum in the cemetery. Walter stared into the dark passage. Will it even be passable after all this time? Only one way to find out, Dr. Chen said, adjusting her backpack. How far is it? About half a mile, Mrs. Thornhill replied. Mostly straight, with a few branches that lead to other properties. We need to stay on the main path. Single file, they entered the tunnel. The air was stale but breathable, the passage narrower than Walter had expected. He had to hunch slightly to avoid hitting his head on the low ceiling. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing cobwebs and the occasional scurrying movement of disturbed rats. I've been thinking about Eliza's journal, Dr. Chen said as they walked, her voice echoing slightly. The way she described the living circuit, it almost sounds like she was working with some form of bioelectricity. In the 1920s? Walter asked skeptically. That's pretty advanced for her time. Many scientific discoveries throughout history were made by people working outside traditional institutions, Mrs. Thornhill replied, especially women who were often excluded. Eliza corresponded with scientists across the world. She might have been exposed to ideas that never made it into mainstream science. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Walter checked his watch. They'd been walking for almost 20 minutes. We must be getting close, he said. As if in response to his words, the tunnel began to slope upward. Ahead, a faint blue-green glow seeped through cracks in the tunnel ceiling. Look, Dr. Chen whispered, pointing. The light from the grave. The tunnel ended at a wall similar to the one they'd entered through. Mrs. Thornhill found another hidden mechanism, and the wall swung open to reveal the inside of the Blackwood mausoleum. Marble tombs lined the walls, the names of long-dead family members etched into stone plaques. We made it, Walter said, relief evident in his voice. Dr. Chen moved to the mausoleum door and peered through a crack. The cemetery is crawling with people. Military personnel, scientists in hazmat suits. They've set up floodlights and equipment all around Eliza's grave. Walter joined her at the door. The scene outside was like something from a science fiction movie. The government had erected a perimeter of temporary fencing around a large section of the cemetery. Inside, dozens of people moved purposefully among trucks and equipment. At the center of it all, Eliza's grave glowed like a small sun, the blue-green light pulsating in a steady rhythm. They've brought in heavy machinery, Walter noted. Looks like they're preparing to excavate. We can't let them do that, Mrs. Thornhill said firmly. Eliza specifically wrote that her work shouldn't be disturbed before it was complete. What's the plan? Walter asked. We can't exactly walk out there and ask them to stop. Dr. Chen bit her lip, thinking. I need to get closer, see exactly what stage the crystal formation is at. According to Eliza's diagram, there should be a final configuration right before whatever is supposed to happen. There's a groundskeeper's shed about 30 yards from here, Walter said. If we can reach it without being seen, it should give us cover to observe. They waited for a patrol to pass, then slipped out of the mausoleum into the shadows. Keeping low, they darted between gravestones, moving closer to the center of activity. The shed Walter had mentioned was just outside the fenced perimeter, providing a perfect vantage point. Crouched behind the shed, they had a clear view of Eliza's grave and the government operations surrounding it. Director Fletcher stood at a portable command center, barking orders to her team. Scientists hurried back and forth carrying equipment and samples. Look at those readings, Dr. Chen whispered, pointing to a large monitor displaying waves of data. The energy output has increased tenfold since we were last here. Mrs. Thornhill opened her satchel and withdrew Eliza's journal and the diagram. According to this, the crystal formation should form a complete circuit just before activation. From what I can see, it's nearly there. Walter's attention was drawn to something else. The townspeople gathered beyond the roadblocks watching the spectacle. News vans had arrived too, reporters doing live broadcasts with the glowing cemetery as their backdrop. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "If whatever happens is dangerous, it won't be," Mrs. Thornhill insisted. "Eliza wouldn't have designed something to hurt people." "You can't know that for sure," Walter argued. "She's been dead for 100 years. Who knows what she intended?" Before Mrs. Thornhill could respond, a commotion broke out near the grave. One of the scientists was gesturing frantically at his equipment. Director Fletcher rushed over, followed by several others. "Something's happening," Dr. Chen whispered. The blue-green glow suddenly intensified, sending shafts of light shooting upward into the night sky. The ground began to vibrate, a low hum building until Walter could feel it in his chest. "It's starting," Mrs. Thornhill breathed. "Whatever Eliza planned, it's happening now." The crystal formations beneath the soil must have completed their circuit, because the entire grave was now outlined in brilliant light. The humming grew louder, and small objects, pens, tools, even someone's glasses, began to float upward, suspended in midair. "Some kind of electromagnetic field," Dr. Chen said, her scientific mind still analyzing despite the incredible scene. "It's affecting anything with metal." Government personnel were retreating, some running in panic. Director Fletcher stood her ground, shouting orders that went unheeded as her team fled to a safer distance. Then something new happened. The light began to coalesce, rising from the grave like a column, before spreading outward to form a dome of pure energy. Within that dome, a shape began to take form, indistinct at first, then resolving into what looked like a human figure. "It's a hologram," Dr. Chen whispered in awe. "Or something like it." The figure became clearer. A woman in early 20th century dress, her hair pinned up in the style of the era. Though translucent and composed entirely of blue-green light, her features were distinct enough to make out a strong jaw, intelligent eyes, and an expression of determination. "Eliza," Mrs. Thornhill said, her voice breaking. "It's her." The glowing figure of Eliza Blackwood hovered above her own grave, looking out at the gathered crowd with an eerily lifelike gaze. Then, to everyone's shock, she began to speak. "If you are seeing this message," the apparition said, her voice somehow carrying clearly across the cemetery, "then 100 years have passed since I entrusted my discovery to the earth. 100 years in which I hoped humanity would evolve beyond the greed and short-sightedness that forced me to hide my work." Walter, Dr. Chen, and Mrs. Thornhill exchanged stunned glances. This was beyond anything they had imagined. A message, across time, delivered by technology that shouldn't have been possible a century ago. "The decision now falls to you," the glowing figure continued. "Tomorrow, at the 100th anniversary of my passing, my life's work will either be released to the world or lost forever." The hologram flickered, the energy field pulsating more rapidly. "Choose wisely," Eliza's voice echoed as her image began to fade. "For some gifts, once rejected, can never be offered again." With those words, the apparition vanished. The light receded back into the grave, though it continued to glow with a steady pulse. The objects that had been floating crashed back to the ground, and a stunned silence fell over the cemetery. Director Fletcher recovered first, immediately ordering her team back to their stations. Even from a distance, Walter could see the intensity in her movements, the urgency with which she consulted with her scientists. "They're going to try to extract whatever's in that grave," he said. Right now, before the final activation, Mrs. Thornhill clutched Eliza's journal to her chest. "We can't let them." Eliza was clear. "The process has to complete naturally, Doctor." Chen was already checking her watch. "It's past midnight. That means today is October 14th. We have less than 24 hours before whatever's going to happen happens." Walter looked from the grave to the government team now swarming around it with renewed purpose, then back to his unlikely companions, a scientist and a librarian, both determined to honor a 100-year-old promise. "So what do we do?" he asked. How do we stop an entire government operation? Mrs. Thornhill's face was set with the same determination he'd seen in the hologram of her great-aunt. We don't have to stop them, she said. We just have to delay them for 24 hours, and I think I know how. Dawn broke over Millhaven with an unusual stillness. The town had barely slept, its residents drawn to windows and rooftops to watch the pulsing light that had now formed a perfect dome over the cemetery hill. Schools had been closed, businesses shut down, and police had established wider evacuation zones around the area at the government's insistence. Walter, Dr. Chen, and Mrs. Thornhill had spent the night in the old Blackwood house, huddled around a makeshift table in the kitchen, developing their plan by the light of battery-powered lanterns. The excavation equipment is scheduled to arrive at noon, Dr. Chen said, checking her phone. My contact at the university says they're bringing in some kind of specialized drilling platform that can cut through the crystalline formations. Walter shook his head. Whatever Eliza left down there, they're determined to get it. Mrs. Thornhill carefully turned a page in her great-aunt's journal. Her eyes were tired from a night of deciphering the cryptic handwriting, but they shone with newfound understanding. I think I've figured out what Eliza discovered, she said quietly, and why it was so dangerous that she felt she had to hide it for a century. Walter and Dr. Chen leaned closer. She called it resonant energy extraction, Mrs. Thornhill continued. As best I can understand from her notes, she found a way to harness the natural vibrations of atoms, not by splitting them like nuclear power, but by creating a harmonic resonance that releases energy without destroying the atoms themselves. Dr. Chen's eyes widened. That would be revolutionary. Clean energy with virtually no waste products, theoretically unlimited, and completely disruptive to every power structure in existence, Walter added, understanding dawning. Oil, companies, coal, nuclear, all suddenly obsolete. Mrs. Thornhill nodded. Exactly why someone might have wanted to suppress her discovery in the 1920s, and why the government is so eager to control it now. But how did she create technology that could last a century? Walter asked. And that hologram last night. That shouldn't have been possible with 1920s science. I don't think it was just science, Mrs. Thornhill said. Eliza's later entries talk about something she called living crystal, a material she discovered that could grow according to predetermined patterns, storing and transmitting both energy and information. She tapped a passage in the journal. She writes that she seeded her grave with these crystals, using her own remains as the organic medium they would need to grow. Dr. Chen shivered slightly. She turned her grave into an incubator for this technology, programming it to mature over 100 years. But why wait so long? Because she didn't trust her own time to use it wisely, Mrs. Thornhill said. Listen to this passage. I have seen the greed of men and the abuse of power. This gift is too great for the world I know. Perhaps in a century, humanity will have grown wiser, more united in purpose. Only then should the key be given. Walter glanced at the window where first light was beginning to spread across the sky. So today's the day. By tonight we'll know if she was right about us being ready. Dr. Chen stood up, stretching her stiff limbs. First, we need to make sure the government doesn't extract whatever's down there before the process completes. I've been thinking about that, Walter said. Mrs. Thornhill, you mentioned the Blackwoods had tunnels connecting to other properties. Yes, several branches off the main passage. They led to various businesses that were part of the smuggling network. Including the power station? Mrs. Thornhill's eyes lit up with understanding. Yes, there was a connection to the old power plant. It's been upgraded since then, but the building is in the same location. If we could cause a temporary blackout, Walter suggested, it might buy us some time. Their drilling equipment would be useless without power. I can do better than that, Dr. Chen said, an idea forming. Remember how I said there were power fluctuations? Energy from the grave feeding back into the grid? What if we reverse that flow somehow? Use the power grid to feed energy to the grave instead, accelerating whatever process Eliza designed. Mrs. Thornhill flipped through the journal. There are diagrams here about energy flow. If we could understand them. We don't have time to fully decipher them, Dr. Chen said. But maybe we don't need to. The crystal formation is already nearly complete. It might just need a final surge to finish the process before the government can interfere. Walter checked his watch. It's 7 a.m. We have 5 hours before their drilling equipment arrives. They gathered what they needed: Eliza's journal, flashlights, tools from Walter's truck, and a makeshift map Mrs. Thornhill drew of the tunnel system. Back through the basement they went, but this time taking a different branch of the underground network. This tunnel was narrower, the air even mustier. Twice they had to clear minor cave-ins, Walter digging through packed dirt with a shovel he'd brought. After nearly an hour of slow progress, they reached a brick wall with a rusted metal door. The old power station should be on the other side, Mrs. Thornhill said, consulting her map. The door was locked, but years of rust had weakened the mechanism. Walter forced it open with a pry bar, revealing a dusty storage room filled with outdated electrical equipment. "Looks like part of the original building," Dr. Chen whispered. "They must have just built around it during renovations." They listened carefully for voices or movement, but heard only the distant hum of machinery. Cautiously, they made their way out of the storage room and into a corridor lined with more modern equipment. "The main control room should be upstairs," Dr. Chen said. "But we don't need that. We need to find the primary junction box for the cemetery district." Walter, who had done electrical work in his younger days, took the lead. "This way," he said, following the largest conduits along the ceiling. They led to a room with massive circuit breakers and transformers. A sign on the door read, "Grid Section 7, North Hills, Cemetery District." "Perfect," Dr. Chen said, examining the equipment. "Now we just need to create a power surge directed specifically at the cemetery without affecting the rest of the town." Walter studied the circuit layout. "If we reroute these main lines and bypass the regulators, we could send a massive surge, but it would blow out the substation. We'd only get one shot." "One shot is all we need," Mrs. Thornhill said firmly. "Eliza's journal suggests the final stage happens very quickly once triggered." Dr. Chen checked her phone. "It's almost 10 a.m. We should wait until just before noon, when their drilling equipment is being set up. That way they won't have time to bring in generators or alternative power sources." They prepared the modifications to the junction box without actually implementing them, setting up a delay switch that would give them time to clear the area before the surge occurred. As Walter worked, Dr. Chen kept watch by the door, monitoring the power station employees' movements. At 11:30 a.m. they were ready. Walter set the delay for 15 minutes, giving them just enough time to exit through the tunnels. "This is it," he said, hand on the switch. "Once I activate this, there's no going back." Mrs. Thornhill nodded solemnly. "Eliza waited 100 years for this moment. I think she'd approve." Walter flipped the switch. A small red light began blinking, counting down the minutes. They hurried back through the storage room and into the tunnel, making their way as quickly as possible through the narrow passage. They emerged from the Blackwood house just as a deep rumble shook the ground. In the distance, the blue-green dome over the cemetery flared brilliantly, sending shafts of light high into the sky. Car alarms went off throughout town, and birds took flight in swirling, panicked flocks. "It's working," Dr. Chen said. "The power surge must have accelerated the final stage of the crystal formation." They hurried toward the cemetery, joining the crowds that had gathered at the police barricades. The government personnel were in disarray, their equipment dead, their vehicles immobilized by the electromagnetic pulse that had accompanied the power surge. Director Fletcher was shouting into a dead radio, her face a mask of frustration. The light from the grave intensified until it was almost painful to look at. Then, with a sound like a massive bell being struck, the dome collapsed inward, concentrating again on Eliza's grave. For a moment, everything went still and silent. Then, the light shot upward in a perfect column, reaching so high it disappeared into the clouds. Where it touched the sky, the clouds began to swirl, forming a spiral pattern visible for miles. "What's happening?" Walter asked, shielding his eyes from the brightness. Before anyone could answer, the column of light expanded outward, forming, not a dome this time, but a perfect sphere that encompassed the entire cemetery. Within it, the air seemed to shimmer and distort, as if reality itself was being bent. The holographic image of Eliza Blackwood appeared again, but this time life-sized and far more detailed. She stood beside her own grave, looking out at the gathered crowds with an expression of cautious hope. "The time has come," her voice echoed, sounding as real and present as if she were truly standing there. "For a century my discovery has grown, evolved, and prepared itself for this moment." She gestured, and the air around her filled with complex, three-dimensional diagrams, blueprints and equations floating in space. "I offer you the key to resonant energy extraction," she continued. "Power drawn, not from the destruction of matter, but from the harmonious vibration of all things. Unlimited, clean-free." The diagrams expanded, multiplied, showing applications and implementations that even Dr. Chen, with all her scientific knowledge, could barely comprehend. "This knowledge belongs to all humanity," Eliza's voice declared. "Not to governments or corporations, but to every person on Earth. It cannot be controlled or contained. Even now it transmits itself across your global networks, embedding itself in your collective knowledge." Director Fletcher was frantically ordering her people to contain the transmission, but their equipment remained dead. Around the world, as they would later learn, the same diagrams were appearing on screens, printing from machines and being carved by strange energies into natural surfaces. Eliza's gift distributing itself beyond anyone's ability to suppress. Use it wisely," the hologram said, her expression solemn. "This power can liberate humanity from scarcity and much of its suffering. Or if misused, it could bring great harm. The choice, as always, remains with you." With those words, Eliza's image began to fade. The crystal formations beneath her grave, having completed their century-long purpose, dissolved into ordinary soil. The light receded, and the cemetery returned to its normal state. Peaceful, quiet, with no visible sign of the extraordinary event that had just occurred, except that everything had changed. In the days that followed, scientists around the world began working with Eliza's blueprints. Early prototypes confirmed what seemed impossible. She had indeed discovered a method of energy extraction that violated none of the laws of physics, yet produced power with almost no negative byproducts. Simple devices built according to her specifications could power homes indefinitely, drawing energy from the atomic vibrations present in all matter. The government attempted to classify the technology, but it was too late. The knowledge had spread too widely, becoming the property of all humanity just as Eliza had intended. 1 month after the event, Walter stood alone by Eliza's grave. The government teams were long gone. The cemetery returned to his care. The headstone had been restored and fresh flowers adorned the plot, left by visitors from around the world who came to pay respects to the woman whose gift had begun to transform human civilization. He knelt and brushed a fallen leaf from the stone. "I think you were right to wait," he said quietly. "I don't know if we're wise enough even now, but at least we have a chance to try." As dusk fell and Walter locked the cemetery gates, he glanced back one last time. For just a moment, he thought, he saw a faint blue-green glow above Eliza's grave, but it might have been just a trick of the light or perhaps the start of another message, meant for another time.